On January 10, 2019, detectives pulled through the gates of one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Bexar County, expecting to investigate what appeared to be another devastating case of multiple homicide. By the time the sun climbed higher over the limestone hills outside San Antonio, the story already seemed complete. News headlines read, "A mother had murdered her children, then herself, and case closed." Except, the people whose job it was to solve murders didn't seem ready to close anything. Because almost immediately, the questions began piling up. Why was the woman's boyfriend, Charlie Wheeler, publicly identified as a person of interest if investigators believed they already knew exactly what had happened? Why would a woman who was allegedly preparing to end her life spend her final days searching for apartments, booking work appointments, and talking about tomorrow? Why did friends remember her speaking about leaving the relationship instead of leaving the world? Why would a woman who had fought for survival from childhood choose to cut short the lives of her children and end it all? Why did two fathers refuse to believe the first explanation they were given? And why, years later, would the sheriff himself admit the investigation deserved another look? Could it be that the reported account of the crime scene was perfectly constructed by someone who orchestrated the whole evidence in such a way that it's nearly impossible to decipher? Or the perpetrator was so clever that the crime scene looked too perfect to reveal any further incriminating evidence that will definitely point the detectives to a different direction and not so obvious narrative? Before we continue, if you're someone who believes every victim deserves to have their story remembered, take a second to subscribe. Every week, we uncover forgotten cases, expose chilling mysteries, and revisit investigations that refuse to be buried. Together, we make sure these stories are never forgotten. Now, let's continue. On the morning of January 10, 2019, a 911 dispatcher in Bexar County answered a call from a man named Charlie Wheeler. His voice carried the kind of panic you'd expect from someone who had just walked into every family's worst nightmare. Wheeler told the dispatcher he had returned to his home in Anaqua Springs Ranch, an exclusive gated community outside San Antonio, and found his girlfriend, Nichol Olsen, dead alongside her two daughters. According to him, Nichol had shot 16-year-old Alexa Montez, then 10-year-old London Bribiescas, before turning the gun on herself. Within minutes, deputies pulled into the long driveway leading to Wheeler's home. They met Wheeler sitting on the floor, with his hands over his face but without a single teardrop. Behind them came detectives, crime scene technicians, photographers, people whose careers had taught them never to trust first impressions. The house stood exactly where it had the day before, untouched by the chaos unfolding inside. Beyond the guarded entrance to the neighborhood, life continued as normal. School buses ran their routes. Morning traffic thickened across San Antonio. People drank coffee, answered emails, and complained about work. They had no idea that, behind one of the most expensive front doors in the county, 3 lives had already come to an end. Upstairs, investigators found exactly what Wheeler had reported. Nichol, Alexa, London, dead from gunshot wounds. Near Nichol's body was a handgun belonging to Charlie Wheeler. At first glance, the scene almost seemed eager to explain itself. No broken windows, no splintered door frames, no public indication that anyone had fought their way into the house. It looked, at least initially, like the kind of scene investigators have seen before. A devastating family tragedy contained within the walls of a single home. And yet, the more experienced detectives looked at it, the less comfortable they became with accepting the obvious. Long before there was a mansion in Anaqua Springs, long before Charlie Wheeler appeared in her story, Nichol's life had already been an endless bout for survival. She was born in 1981, into circumstances that offered very little certainty. Before most children begin forming memories that stay with them for life, tragedy had already found its way to her family. At just 7 years old, Nichol lost her father to a drug overdose. It was the kind of loss that leaves children with questions no one can answer. Years later, life dealt another blow. Her mother, the one constant she still had, died from heart disease. 2 parents, gone before Nichol had fully entered adulthood. Most people spend their 20s leaning on their parents for advice, support, or simply the reassurance that someone is there if everything falls apart. Nichol didn't have that luxury. By the time she was old enough to build her own life, the people who were supposed to help her build it were gone. If there was one quality that emerged from those losses, it was resilience. Not the kind people post about on social media, the quieter kind. The kind that gets up the next morning because there isn't another option. That resilience would be tested again before she even reached adulthood. At just 15 years old, while most girls her age were worried about high school friendships, driver's licenses, and what life might look like after graduation, Nichol was holding her first child. Her son, Skylar, changed everything. Teenage motherhood has a way of forcing life to move faster than anyone is prepared for. Childhood ends almost overnight. Every decision suddenly carries the weight of another person's future. There are diapers to buy before there are careers to build. Doctor's appointments before college applications. Responsibilities arrive years before most people have learned how to carry them. For many teenagers, those circumstances become defining limitations. For Nichol, friends say they became motivation. She wasn't interested in sympathy. She was interested in surviving. The relationship with Skylar's father eventually ended, and like so many young mothers trying to rebuild after a failed relationship, Nichol found herself standing at another crossroads. She was still trying to create stability when life became more complicated once again. Years later, she welcomed her second child, Alexa Montez. Alexa's father was David Montez, and for a time, Nichol believed she might finally be building the family she'd spent years searching for. But that relationship also came to an end. Another chapter closed, another future rewritten. By then, the pattern had become painfully familiar. Every time life appeared ready to settle, something shifted beneath her feet. Still, she kept moving. Then came her youngest daughter, London Bribiescas. London's father, Hector Bribiescas, would later become one of the most outspoken voices demanding answers after her death. But years before that, he and Nichol were simply two parents trying to raise a little girl after their own relationship had ended. Like many separated parents, they navigated the complicated balance of co-parenting while building separate lives. 3 children, 3 fathers. More responsibility than most people carry in a lifetime. It's easy for strangers to reduce those facts to statistics. People who knew Nichol saw something completely different. They saw a woman who refused to let disappointment become an excuse. By then, every dollar mattered. There were periods when financial pressure seemed almost relentless. Court records show that portions of her income were garnished because of legal obligations tied to child support. Bills arrived whether business was good or bad. Rent didn't become cheaper because life became harder. Raising 3 children meant stretching every paycheck further than it was ever meant to go. Yet almost no one remembers Nichol complaining. Instead, she worked. Friends often joked that if Nichol wasn't with her children, she was probably behind a salon chair. Hairdressing wasn't simply a profession to her. It became her second chance. She had an eye for style, but what truly set her apart was the way she connected with people. Clients would book appointments for a haircut and end up staying because conversation came naturally. She remembered birthdays. She asked about people's children. She celebrated their promotions, comforted them through divorces, laughed with them through ordinary days that never make headlines. Over time, clients stopped feeling like customers. They became part of her life. In an industry built on trust, Nichol earned plenty of it. The money wasn't extravagant, but it was honest. Every appointment meant another bill paid, another school expense covered, another step toward giving her children the childhood she wished she'd had herself. And for the first time in years, she began imagining something beyond survival. Friends recall her talking about expanding her business, selling handmade jewelry, creating additional streams of income. She wasn't dreaming about becoming rich. She was dreaming about breathing, about reaching a place where every unexpected expense didn't feel like another emergency. Everything she did revolved around her children. Alexa was beginning to grow into a young woman. Intelligent, artistic, and increasingly independent, she was approaching the stage of life where college, careers, and adulthood no longer felt far away. Nichol often spoke proudly about her oldest daughter, believing she possessed a maturity well beyond her years. London was different. She was still wonderfully young, full of energy, curious about everything. She loved performing art, loved music, and loved making people smile. She had recently become excited about auditioning for America's Got Talent, and like so many 10-year-olds, she believed impossible dreams simply needed enough effort to become real. Nichol encouraged those dreams, not because she expected London to become famous, because she never wanted her children to believe life had to be limited by the circumstances they were born into. Perhaps that was Nichol's greatest strength. She had experienced enough heartbreak to become cynical. Instead, she became hopeful. Again and again, she convinced herself that the next chapter of her life might finally be different. Life has a strange way of rewarding perseverance just when people are about to stop expecting it. By the summer of 2016, Nichol Olsen had spent more than half her life recovering from one disappointment after another. She had buried both of her parents before reaching middle age. She had raised 3 children through relationships that hadn't lasted. She had worked long hours behind a salon chair simply to keep life moving forward. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't easy, but she'd built something that belonged to her. She wasn't searching for a fairy tale anymore. Fairy tales belonged to younger people. Nichol was searching for something much simpler: stability. Then, one afternoon, her phone lit up with an Instagram message from someone she'd never met. His name was Charlie Wheeler. On the surface, there was nothing remarkable about it. Thousands of relationships begin exactly the same way every day. A direct message, a casual conversation, a shared joke between 2 strangers who happened to cross paths online. Had Nichol ignored that message, this story would probably never have existed. Instead, she replied, "The conversations came easily. Charlie was confident without seeming arrogant, successful without needing to advertise it. Friends would later describe him as charismatic, intelligent, and surprisingly attentive. Unlike many men Nichol had dated in the past, Charlie wasn't struggling to build a career. He already had one. He came from a prominent Texas family whose wealth stretched back generations through ranching, oil, and business. By the time he met Nichol, Charlie had built successful companies of his own and enjoyed the kind of financial security most people only imagine. Expensive dinners weren't special occasions. They were Tuesday nights. Weekend trips didn't require months of saving. They happened on impulse. To someone who had spent years calculating every grocery bill and every utility payment, Charlie's world must have felt almost unreal. Friends remember seeing a version of Nichol they hadn't seen in years. She smiled more. She laughed more. She talked about the future with an optimism that had slowly disappeared over the years. It wasn't because Charlie was wealthy, at least, not entirely. It was because wealth represented something she'd almost never experienced: breathing room. No more wondering whether the car would survive another month, choosing between one bill and another, and no more carrying every responsibility alone. For the first time in years, life appeared to be giving more than it was taking away. The relationship moved quickly. Looking back, perhaps that isn't surprising. People who've spent years searching for stability often recognize it, or what appears to be stability, the moment they believe they've found it. Before long, Charlie wasn't simply dating Nichol, he was becoming part of her children's lives. Alexa, already a teenager, watched the relationship with the cautious awareness that older children often have. Teenagers don't hand out trust easily. They've usually seen enough of life to know that adults sometimes make promises they can't keep. London, on the other hand, embraced Charlie much more naturally. She was still young enough to see the world through uncomplicated eyes. If the adults around her were smiling, she smiled too. By early 2017, Charlie made a decision that, to anyone standing outside the relationship, looked like the beginning of a happy ending. He purchased a sprawling home inside Anaqua Springs Ranch, one of the most exclusive gated communities in the San Antonio area. It was the kind of property that photographs beautifully. Stone architecture, manicured lawns, towering trees, a backyard built for family gatherings. From the outside, it looked less like a house than the reward waiting at the end of years of hard work. When Nichol and her daughters moved in, friends genuinely believed she'd finally made it. After everything she'd survived, after every financial struggle, after years of carrying life on her own shoulders, she was finally living in a home most people could only dream of owning. Pictures from that period tell a convincing story. Family dinners, vacations, birthday celebrations, smiling faces gathered around a swimming pool. If happiness could be measured through photographs alone, there would have been no reason for detectives to investigate anything beyond the crime scene years later. But photographs are experts at lying. They capture moments. They don't capture what happens 5 minutes before the picture is taken, or 5 minutes after. As detectives slowly worked their way through Nichol's inner circle, something unexpected began happening. Almost nobody started their stories by talking about Charlie's money. They talked about his personality. Some described him as generous. Others remembered him as protective. Several simply said he loved Nichol. At first, those descriptions seemed perfectly ordinary, until investigators noticed that the conversations didn't end there. Almost every compliment carried a pause, a hesitation, as though people were deciding whether they should continue, and eventually, they did. One friend remembered that Nichol had become increasingly difficult to reach after moving into the mansion. Another noticed she no longer seemed as spontaneous as she'd once been. The woman who used to make plans without thinking twice now often checked first. Sometimes she canceled altogether. Individually, those observations meant very little. People change. Relationships change. Moving into a new home naturally changes routines. Experienced detectives know better than to mistake coincidence for evidence. But they also know something equally important. Patterns don't usually announce themselves. They emerge quietly, one conversation at a time, one memory at a time, one witness after another describing the same uncomfortable feeling from entirely different perspectives. Then investigators spoke to one of Nichol's closest friends. She told them about a photo shoot. Relationships rarely collapse all at once. More often, they erode quietly, almost politely, one uncomfortable moment at a time. There isn't a dramatic beginning, no single argument that changes everything overnight. Instead, there are moments so small they seem forgettable when they happen. Until something terrible occurs, and suddenly, every one of those moments demands to be remembered. That was the pattern investigators kept hearing as they interviewed the people who knew Nichol best. Different stories. Different occasions. The same uneasy feeling. One of the first people detectives spoke with was Vanessa De La Rosa. Vanessa wasn't a casual acquaintance. She had watched Nichol navigate years of heartbreak, financial hardship, and the endless balancing act of raising children while building a career. She knew the version of Nichol that existed before Charlie Wheeler entered the picture, which meant she was in a unique position to recognize when something about her friend began to change. One memory stayed with her more than any other. It happened during a professional photo shoot. Nothing about the day was unusual. Nichol arrived, greeted everyone warmly, and settled into the routine she'd done countless times before. But as Vanessa stood talking to her, something caught her eye. There was bruising around Nichol's left eye. Not dramatic, not severe. Just enough to interrupt what had otherwise been a familiar face. Vanessa asked the obvious question. "Nichol, what happened?" According to Vanessa, her friend hesitated for a moment before brushing it aside. She reportedly said she and Charlie had gotten into an argument, then almost immediately steered the conversation somewhere else. It was subtle, but Vanessa noticed it. Nichol, who usually had no trouble talking through life's frustrations, suddenly seemed determined to close the subject before it had even begun. At the time, Vanessa let it go. Years later, she would wonder whether she should have pressed harder. Detectives, of course, couldn't treat one bruise as proof of anything. People are injured every day. Couples argue, accidents happen. But homicide investigators don't isolate moments. They collect them. One memory means very little. 10 memories pointing in the same direction begin to demand attention. Then they met Monica Villarreal. If Vanessa remembered the bruise, Monica remembered the phone call. It came during the summer of 2017, when Charlie and Nichol had traveled to Galveston to celebrate their anniversary. Anniversary trips are supposed to strengthen relationships. According to Monica, this one exposed fractures that had been hidden beneath the surface. Something happened between Charlie and Nichol that weekend. The exact sequence of events has never been fully established in public records, but according to Monica's account, the argument escalated to the point that hotel security became involved. Charlie was reportedly asked to leave the property. What happened next left a much deeper impression. According to Monica, Charlie gathered his belongings, loaded Nichol's luggage into his vehicle, took her cell phone, and drove away, leaving her behind in a city hundreds of miles from home. Imagine that for a moment. You're stranded. Your luggage is gone. Your phone is gone. The person you trusted to bring you home has disappeared. Eventually, Nichol managed to contact Monica. Without hesitation, Monica got into her car. By the time she reached Galveston, she wasn't picking up the confident, resilient woman she'd always known. She was picking up a friend who, according to her recollection, looked emotionally exhausted. The drive back became something neither woman would ever forget. For nearly 17 hours, they talked. Nichol cried. She talked about the relationship, about the arguments, about feeling emotionally worn down. Monica would later recall that, somewhere during that long drive, Nichol said something she'd never heard before. She wanted to leave Charlie. Not cool off. Not take a break. Leave. For Monica, it sounded final. After everything she'd heard that day, she genuinely believed her friend had reached the end of the relationship. Then came the part that would frustrate so many people who later learned the story. The next day, Nichol went back. People who've never lived through emotionally controlling relationships often ask the same question. Why? Why go back after making the decision to leave? Why return after 17 hours of tears? Why choose the same relationship that had caused so much pain? The answer, detectives know, is rarely simple. Leaving isn't usually a single decision. It's a process. People leave emotionally long before they leave physically, and many return several times before they're able to walk away for good. Hope has a remarkable ability to survive even inside relationships that are quietly coming apart. Whatever happened after Galveston, the relationship continued. But, according to Vanessa De La Rosa, the changes in Nichol became more noticeable. One evening in January 2018, the two friends attended a San Antonio Spurs game together. It was supposed to be nothing more than a night away, a chance to laugh, catch up, and enjoy a few hours without thinking about work or responsibilities. Instead, Charlie's phone calls kept interrupting the evening. One call became two, then three. Eventually, according to Vanessa, Charlie insisted on speaking directly to her. She handed over the phone. The conversation was brief, but one sentence stayed with her. "You're lucky I even let her go with you." Vanessa would later say the words unsettled her immediately, not because Charlie sounded angry, because of the language he chose. "I let her." It wasn't concern. It sounded like permission, control, and coercion. The game eventually ended, and the two women decided to stop at a jazz club before heading home. They had barely settled in when Nichol's phone rang again. Charlie. According to Vanessa, he knew exactly where they were. He told Nichol to come home. The evening was over. Looking back, Vanessa didn't describe a single explosive confrontation. She described something harder to define. A relationship where ordinary moments increasingly revolved around one person's approval. Then came the visit she says she has never been able to forget. It was the summer of 2018 when Vanessa accepted an invitation to spend the afternoon at the Wheeler home. The house was exactly what people imagined it would be. Beautiful. Spacious. Immaculately designed. Outside, she and Nichol relaxed in the hot tub while the girls played nearby. For a while, it felt like every other afternoon they'd shared over the years. Then Charlie stormed outside, enraged. According to Vanessa, his expression changed the atmosphere almost instantly. The reason? Someone had dropped a slice of pepperoni on the kitchen floor. Vanessa remembers Charlie ordering Nichol out of the hot tub so she could clean up after the children. It wasn't the pepperoni that bothered her. Children make messes. Parents clean them up. It was the way he did it. The tone. The timing. The fact that it happened in front of everyone. The afternoon never recovered. Later, another disagreement erupted after the home's sound system stopped working. According to Vanessa, Charlie immediately blamed the girls, despite there being no clear indication they had caused the problem. By then, the visit had become so uncomfortable that Vanessa decided to leave early. As she gathered her things near the front door, she looked back at Nichol. The woman standing in front of her wasn't the same fiercely independent friend she'd watched rebuild her life from almost nothing. She looked careful, almost as though she was afraid of occupying too much space inside her own home. Vanessa couldn't shake the feeling. Before walking out, she turned to Nichol and quietly said, "You look like a guest in your own house." Nichol didn't react. She didn't argue. According to Vanessa, she simply looked around for a moment before answering in a voice so soft it almost disappeared. "You are right. This is Charlie's house, not mine." That sentence would stay with Vanessa long after the yellow crime scene tape surrounded the property. Because by the time detectives came knocking on her door in January 2019, she couldn't stop wondering whether her friend had been trying to tell everyone something, without ever saying it outright. And as investigators continued piecing together the final months of Nichol's life, they uncovered evidence suggesting that, this time, she may have been preparing to do more than talk about leaving. She may have already been planning her escape. The exit plan. People often imagine that the end of a relationship arrives with a slammed door, a screaming match, a suitcase dragged across the floor, one final goodbye. Real life is rarely that dramatic. More often, people leave in silence long before they leave in person. They begin imagining a different address, a different routine, a different future. They stop asking themselves whether the relationship can be saved and start asking a much quieter question. Where would I go? By the closing months of 2018, detectives would come to believe Nichol Olsen had reached that stage. Not because of one argument, not because of one witness. Because every thread they pulled seemed to lead to the same conclusion. She wasn't simply unhappy. She appeared to be preparing for life after Charlie Wheeler. The first clues came from the people who saw Nichol almost every day. Her clients, her co-workers, The women who occupied the salon chairs weren't just paying for hair appointments. Over the years, many had become friends. Hair salons have a way of becoming confession booths without walls. Conversations drift naturally from hairstyles to marriages, children, finances, dreams, disappointments. By the time someone's color is finished processing, life stories have often been exchanged. Nichol was usually the one listening, but during those final months, some of the people closest to her noticed she had begun talking more than usual. Not dramatically, not desperately, just enough that they sensed something weighing on her. She didn't paint Charlie as a monster. Life is almost never that simple. Instead, according to people who later spoke with investigators, she described a relationship that had become exhausting. Arguments seemed to happen more frequently. She appeared increasingly anxious about keeping the peace. The woman who once tackled life's problems head-on was beginning to measure her words before speaking them. That wasn't the Nichol they remembered. Neither Vanessa de la Rosa nor Monica Villarreal described their friend as someone who intimidated easily. If anything, she'd spent most of her adult life proving she could survive without depending on anyone, which made what happened next all the more significant. According to Monica, Nichol reached out again. This wasn't another emotional breakdown like the one following Galveston. It felt different, calmer, more deliberate. Instead of talking about leaving, she was discussing how to leave. There's an important difference. One is driven by emotion. The other requires planning. Detectives would later uncover evidence suggesting those plans had quietly begun taking shape. Nichol had started looking for apartments. Not luxury homes, not dream houses. Apartments. Small, practical, affordable. Exactly the kind of place someone rents when they're trying to rebuild from the beginning. That detail matters because it reveals something about the life she imagined beyond Charlie Wheeler. She wasn't looking for another wealthy partner. She wasn't searching for someone else to rescue her. She was preparing to stand on her own feet again, the same way she always had. Friends would later say, that sounded exactly like Nichol. If she was going to leave, she'd do it herself. Around that same time, another subtle change caught people's attention. Nichol became unusually protective of her work schedule. To anyone else, it looked like a woman focused on growing her business. To detectives reconstructing her final months, it looked like someone making sure she could support herself. Every appointment mattered. Every client mattered. And every dollar mattered. Because independence isn't simply an emotional decision. It's a financial one. The more investigators learned about Nichol's plans, the more one question kept surfacing. Did Charlie know? No public evidence has ever established exactly how much Charlie Wheeler knew about Nichol's apartment search or whether she had told him she intended to leave. Investigators have never released any statement confirming such a conversation took place. What they did know was this: relationships rarely change in only one direction. If one person senses distance, the other often senses it too. Whether Charlie interpreted those changes correctly remains unknown. But according to people close to the couple, the atmosphere inside the house continued growing more tense. Even small disagreements reportedly seemed capable of becoming much larger ones. By now, detectives had also begun reviewing public records connected to the Wheeler residence. Those records revealed something many people outside the investigation had never heard about. Law enforcement had been called to the home on multiple occasions before anyone died there. The reports released publicly provide very little detail about what prompted those responses or how deputies resolved them. They don't tell us who was at fault. They don't establish criminal conduct. But they do establish something important. This was not the first time authorities had been asked to come to that address. For detectives, that mattered. Not because it answered their questions, because it gave them more questions to ask. As investigators continued interviewing witnesses, another name became increasingly important: Hector Bribiescas, London's father. Unlike many people commenting on the case years later, Hector wasn't trying to reconstruct his daughter from news articles. He knew her. He knew the excitement in her voice whenever she talked about music. He knew how badly she wanted to perform. Only days before her death, London had been looking forward to an opportunity that, to a 10-year-old, felt enormous. Auditions connected to America's Got Talent were coming to San Antonio. She wanted to go. According to Hector, he spoke with Nichol about it. Together, they decided it probably wasn't the right time. Another opportunity would come along. Then Hector talked to London herself. Nothing about the conversation alarmed him. She sounded like London. Happy, energetic, already looking ahead to tomorrow. Years later, Hector would return to that phone call again and again, searching for something he'd missed. Some hidden sadness, some clue, some goodbye. He never found one. Investigators couldn't ignore conversations like that, not because they disproved anything, but because they became part of a much larger picture. Nichol was discussing future plans. London was talking about future dreams. Life, from their perspective, seemed to be continuing. As Christmas gave way to the new year, the investigation's timeline became increasingly precise. Cell phone records, emails, appointment books, security logs. Piece by piece, detectives reconstructed the days leading into January 2019. Then they found an email that would become one of the most discussed documents in the entire case. On January 9th, less than 24 hours before she died, Nichol received confirmation that an apartment she had been interested in was available. It wasn't just another online listing. It was a real opportunity, a door opening. Investigators couldn't know what decision Nichol intended to make after receiving that email. Perhaps she planned to sign the lease. Perhaps she wanted more time. Perhaps she hadn't made up her mind. One fact became difficult to ignore, but what investigators discovered next would shock an entire community. Before we continue, if you believe every victim deserves to have their story remembered, consider subscribing. While one narrative suggested that Nichol was preparing to end her life, the evidence detectives were uncovering painted the picture of a woman arranging for another one. And if she truly intended to leave, what happened when she walked through the front door that evening? That question hangs over the entire investigation. Because everything you've heard so far, the bruises Vanessa remembered. The 17-hour drive Monica never forgot. The apartment search, the growing tension, London's excitement about the future, all of it leads to one date. January 9th, 2019. The final 24 hours. The hours investigators would replay more than any others. The hours that would determine whether this was exactly what it appeared to be, or something far more complicated. The last 24 hours. Every homicide investigation eventually arrives at a point where the timeline becomes more important than the testimony. People forget. Memories change. Conversations blur together. But phones don't forget. Emails don't forget, and security cameras don't. Long after witnesses struggle to remember whether something happened at 6 o'clock or 7, technology quietly preserves the rhythm of an ordinary day. One text message, one timestamp, one phone call at a time. For detectives investigating what happened inside Charlie Wheeler's home, January 9, 2019, became less of a date and more of a puzzle. Every new piece seemed to fit somewhere. The problem was that, when assembled, the picture still refused to look complete. The day began without any obvious signs that it would end in tragedy. Nichol went about her routine much as she always had. She communicated with clients, discussed appointments, and handled the ordinary responsibilities that had filled her calendar for years. Nothing about her schedule suggested someone saying goodbye to life. If anything, it reflected the habits of a woman who expected tomorrow to arrive just like every other tomorrow. Then came the email. It wasn't dramatic. There were no flashing warnings, no life-altering declaration. Just a message informing Nichol that the apartment she'd been interested in was available. To anyone else, it might have looked like another notification among dozens received every week. To detectives, it became something much larger, because this wasn't simply an apartment. It represented a destination. For months, investigators had been listening to Vanessa de la Rosa describe a friend who no longer seemed comfortable inside her own home. They had listened to Monica Villarreal recount a 17-hour drive from Galveston, during which Nichol repeatedly spoke about leaving Charlie. Now they were looking at evidence, suggesting those conversations had quietly evolved into action. Dreams had become plans. Plans had become opportunities. Whether Nichol intended to sign the lease that very day remains unknown. But detectives couldn't ignore the direction in which her life appeared to be moving. Away. Not toward an ending. Toward another beginning. That afternoon unfolded with remarkable normalcy. Nichol confirmed work appointments. She exchanged messages with people who expected to see her again. Nothing publicly released by investigators suggests those conversations carried the tone of final farewells. There were no cryptic messages, no apologies, no sudden attempts to reconnect with people she'd lost touch with years earlier. Life simply continued. Perhaps the most heartbreaking conversation of the day belonged to someone too young to understand how precious ordinary moments can become. London Bribiescas. Her father, Hector Bribiescas, called to speak with her. The two had been talking about auditions connected to America's Got Talent. London loved performing. She loved music. Like so many children her age, She believed impossible dreams were only impossible until someone tried. Before speaking with London, Hector and Nichol discussed whether she should attend the auditions. Together, they decided it might be better to wait. Another opportunity would come. It was an ordinary parenting decision, the kind divorced parents make every day. No raised voices, no panic, no indication that anyone believed this conversation would become their last. Then Hector spoke to his daughter. Years later, he would search that memory for clues. Did she sound frightened? Did she hesitate? Did she say anything unusual? According to Hector, she didn't. She sounded excited, happy, exactly like a 10-year-old looking forward to tomorrow. That memory has become one of the hardest for him to carry because it offered nothing to prepare him for what came next. As evening settled over Anaqua Springs, the neighborhood slipped into its usual rhythm. Garage doors closed. Porch lights flickered on. Families sat down for dinner. Beyond the guarded entrance, security cameras continued recording every vehicle that passed beneath them, unaware they were preserving footage that investigators would study for years. Somewhere inside the Wheeler home, however, the atmosphere had changed. According to Charlie Wheeler's account, he and Nichol became involved in a serious argument. Investigators have never publicly disclosed exactly what that argument was about, nor have they released evidence establishing who said what during those final hours. The only detailed public account of the confrontation came from Wheeler himself. He told investigators the argument became intense enough that he decided to leave the house. On the surface, it wasn't an unreasonable explanation. People leave arguments all the time. Some take a drive. Some go for a walk. Some simply need distance before saying something they'll regret. Security cameras at the entrance to Anaqua Springs later confirmed that Charlie Wheeler's vehicle exited the community that evening. That much wasn't disputed. The cameras captured it. For investigators, the footage established an important anchor point in the timeline. It also introduced a new series of questions. After leaving the neighborhood, Wheeler began sending text messages, not just to Nichol, to members of her family as well. According to records later referenced in civil court filings, the messages expressed concern about Nichol's emotional state following their argument. On paper, that might sound entirely reasonable. If someone leaves after a difficult fight and remains worried about the person they've left behind, reaching out to family members could be interpreted as an attempt to get help. But detectives are trained to ask a second question. If someone genuinely believes the person inside the house is experiencing a crisis, why stop at text messages? Why not call 911? Why not ask deputies to conduct a welfare check? Why not drive back? Those questions would later become central to the civil lawsuits filed by David Montez and Hector Bribiescas. Their lawsuits didn't accuse Charlie Wheeler of murder. Instead, they argued that, based on his own account of events, his actions that night deserved far greater scrutiny. Then, as investigators dug deeper into the digital evidence, another message emerged. This one didn't come from Charlie. According to court filings, a text message was sent from Alexa Montez's phone. "Are you here? I think she's talking to herself." 8 words. That was all. Yet those 8 words would become some of the most analyzed in the entire case. Who typed them? Alexa? Someone else? Investigators have never publicly answered that question. Cellular records can identify the device. They cannot always identify the hands holding it. That uncertainty has followed the case ever since. As midnight approached, the timeline grew stranger still. Records later referenced in court proceedings indicated that multiple attempts were made to call 911 from Nichol's phone. One of those calls briefly connected. No meaningful conversation followed. The line went dead. Imagine sitting in the communications center that night. A call comes in. Silence. The line disconnects. You move on to the next emergency because you have no way of knowing what was happening on the other end. Years later, investigators would still be asking the same questions everyone else was asking. Who made those calls? Why didn't anyone speak? What was happening inside that house during those moments of silence? Those answers have never been publicly released. By sunrise on January 10th, whatever had happened inside the Wheeler home was already over. 3 people who had gone to bed expecting another tomorrow would never wake up again. 1 man remained alive. And by 9:08 that morning, Charlie Wheeler would place the 911 call that transformed a private tragedy into one of Texas's most fiercely debated death investigations. Before detectives could determine whether the timeline supported Charlie's version of events, they first had to answer an even more difficult question. Did the evidence inside that house tell the same story he did? Or was it telling another story altogether? In March 2019, the Bexar County Medical Examiner's Office officially ruled that Nichol Olsen had shot her daughters, Alexa Montez and London Bribiescas, before taking her own life. On paper, the case appeared settled. For many people following the story from a distance, there was nothing left to investigate. But inside the Bexar County Sheriff's Office, the story wasn't over. Sheriff Javier Salazar made it clear that detectives were not prepared to simply close the file. Charlie Wheeler remained publicly identified as a person of interest, a designation that immediately raised the question so many people were already asking. If investigators believed they knew exactly what had happened, why keep investigating? That question only grew louder as the years passed. Rather than disappearing into storage, the case remained active. Detectives continued reviewing evidence. The investigation was eventually reassigned to a cold case detective, and the FBI assisted in examining aspects of the case. Sheriff Salazar later acknowledged publicly that he believed the original investigation had not been as thorough as it should have been. Those aren't the actions of an agency eager to forget a case. They're the actions of investigators still searching for certainty. Meanwhile, the fight shifted away from the crime scene and into the courtroom. David Montez, Alexa's father, and Hector Bribiescas, London's father, each filed wrongful death lawsuits against Charlie Wheeler. The lawsuits argued that serious questions surrounding the deaths had never been adequately answered and sought to hold Wheeler civilly responsible. Charlie, through his legal team, denied the allegations. It's important to understand what never happened. Charlie Wheeler has never been criminally charged in connection with the deaths of Nichol Olsen, Alexa Montez, or London Bribiescas. Legally, he remains innocent of any crime. And yet, the investigation has never produced the sense of finality that usually follows a solved case. That tension has kept the story alive. To some, the medical examiner's findings provide the answer. To others, the witness accounts, Nichol's reported plans to move out, the apartment inquiry, the timeline, and the sheriff's continued doubts leave questions that still haven't been resolved. Perhaps that's why this case continues to resonate years later. Not because people are fascinated by violence, but because certainty never arrived. 3 lives ended inside a house that was supposed to represent a fresh beginning. A hardworking mother who had spent years fighting for stability. A 16-year-old girl standing on the edge of adulthood. A 10-year-old child dreaming of singing on a national stage. None of them ever walked out of that house again. The people who loved them have spent years searching for answers. Some believe they already have them. Others are still waiting. And somewhere between those two positions lies a case that refuses to fade into history. Because until every question is answered to the satisfaction of those left behind, the story of Nichol Olsen, Alexa Montez, and London Bribiescas will remain exactly what it has been from the very beginning, a tragedy, surrounded by doubt. Behind every case is a real person whose life mattered. If today's story moved you, the best way to help ensure these stories continue to be told is by subscribing. Leave your thoughts below. Share this video with someone who appreciates thoughtful true crime. And until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and never stop seeking the truth. Here is another fascinating crime that left detectives puzzled for years until they found a missing piece of evidence that totally named the criminal.